told the Great Library of Alexandria died screaming in a fire started by Julius Caesar in 48 BC. But a generation later, the library was still very much open for business. The library wasn't destroyed in one event. It was fighting a slow biological war against its own shelves. This wasn't an arson, it was a centuries-long decay. By the time Caesar arrived, the library was a 300-year-old collection of plant matter. Papyrus isn't inert like modern paper. It's a sugary, organic plant stem. And the sheets were glued together with a paste made of flour and water. To a weevil, that's not glue. It's a 3-course meal with a literary backdrop. Beyond the pests, papyrus loves to decay. The Greek kings who built Alexandria chose the worst possible location for organic chemistry. Unlike the Dead Sea, where scrolls survived for millennia in dry caves, the desert acting like a kiln, Alexandria was a humid steam room that fermented history. In this climate, knowledge on a scroll lasts around a century, unless it's constantly recopied. The library wasn't a vault, it was a relay race. The scribes weren't authors, they were overqualified human photocopiers. They frantically recopied thousands of fading texts annually just to avoid a glorified compost heap. Meanwhile, across the sea, a rival library in the city of Pergamum was growing fast. Fearing a loss of intellectual status, the king of Alexandria banned the export of papyrus, effectively starving the competition of paper. But it backfired. Forced to improvise, Pergamum traded botany for butchery, using animal skin parchment with a 1,000-year shelf life that effectively retired the need for constant recopying. While Pergamum upgraded, Alexandria stayed cheap. They built their empire on rotting grass, and that meant the clock was always ticking. For 300 years, Alexandria's system worked. As the ancient physician Galen later recorded, the library expanded through what was essentially a book scam, known as the Fund of the Ships. They seized every scroll from incoming ships, copied them, kept the originals, and gave the captains back the cheap copies. The collection was split between the royal quarters' massive research campus, the Mausion, and a backup bunker across the city called the Serapeum. But the library was often just a storage wing. The kings poured their real money into a campus observatory, a grand banquet hall, and a zoo. Because books are quiet, but a royal giraffe makes a statement. Sure, the books were the big selling point, but the scholars stayed for the tax-exempt salary and the all-you-can-eat buffet. Alexandria was like an ancient R&D department. It cranked out real breakthroughs, early experiments with steam power, advanced geometry and astronomy, to solve the practical problems of a growing empire. But it wasn't hoarding blueprints for anti-gravity or whatever other magic the internet decided we've forgotten. We know this thanks to a receipt history actually kept, a 120-volume catalogue called the Pinakes, compiled by a librarian called Callimachus. The Pinakes confirmed the library wasn't a magic vault. It was a curated archive of Greek literature, philosophy, and endless soul-crushing tax records. We didn't lose magic. We lost administrative noise. The casualties likely included a mix of outdated anatomical sketches and provincial chronicles, specialised data that was only worth copying for a few generations. Centuries of these footnotes vanished the moment the maintenance budget hit zero. But Alexandria didn't have a monopoly on knowledge. If a scroll rotted in Egypt, copies often gathered dust in Athens or Syracuse. And this wasn't a shared cultural loss because it was never a public library. You couldn't just wander in and browse. This was a fortress for the elite. If you weren't a royal scholar, the doors were locked. But a fortress only stays strong if it's operational. The collapse didn't start with an enemy army, it started with a brain drain. The rot began long before Caesar. In 145 BC, a paranoid king named Ptolemy VIII, known as the Potbelly, decided the intellectuals were a threat to his ego. He purged the scholars and exiled the head librarian. The buildings remained, but the intellectual maintenance crew had been fired. The library would eventually restock, but the precedent was set. The scholars were expendable. Then came the false alarms. When Caesar burned the harbour in 48 BC, the smoke was dramatic, but any damage to the library was accidental. He burned the export warehouses on the docks, the bargain bin copies waiting to be shipped out. The main archives up the hill in the royal quarter survived. But inside the archives, the rot was winning. The scrolls were yellowing, fraying, and begging for a fresh copy. and the scribes were struggling to keep up. Knowledge in Alexandria had a physical half-life. Without funding, the archive didn't burn. It expired, one crumbling scroll at a time. For 2 centuries of Roman rule, the library functioned as a legacy institution. But by 215 AD, the empire was broke. Cue Emperor Caracalla. He didn't arrive to burn the books, he showed up to balance them. When the choice is buying paper or paying the men with swords to not murder you, the library budget is the first to go. This system only works when materials are cheap, labour is funded, and the state is stable. By the 3rd century, Alexandria had none of the three. Caracalla massacred the city, and more importantly, he pulled the plug on the library. He evicted the latest generation of foreign scholars and stopped their wages. The scribes looked at their worthless copper coins and the rotting shelves, then simply walked off the job. Then came the inflation. The price of papyrus skyrocketed. The relay race stopped, and the rot began to feast. The final blow was physical. In 272 AD, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra turned the royal quarter into a war zone. Emperor Aurelian smashed the palaces to retake the city. By the time the dust settled, the library buildings were likely ruins. The archives were now a tomb. 300 years of humidity had turned the wisdom of the ancients into dust. Even if the media survived, the data died. By the 4th century, linguistic drift encrypted the scrolls. The key was gone. People ask if the Vatican has backups. It doesn't. Rome's part of the same Mediterranean rot zone as Alexandria. Without perpetual recopying, physics destroys them everywhere. So when a Christian mob finally kicked down the doors of the Serapeum in 391 AD, they didn't find a hoard of forbidden knowledge. They broke into a room that had already been hollowed out. Finally, we have the myth that Arabs burned the books to heat the city's bathhouses after they conquered it in 641 AD. But a bathhouse fire would have been impossible with papyrus, which is basically ancient flash paper, more like kindling than firewood. Besides, why would the Arabs burn books in Alexandria when they spent the next 3 centuries hunting down every Greek text they could find to translate in Baghdad? Later historians preferred a villain because it's easier to blame an invader than a lapsed maintenance contract. Without the constant upkeep, Alexandria shrank. The empire's roar faded to a whisper. By the Middle Ages, the Queen of the Mediterranean had become a simple fishing village. History prefers a dramatic ending, a torch, a mob, an invading army. But the Library of Alexandria didn't die in a fire. The real tragedy is that the scrolls were allowed to decay. Saving them required constant copying, which meant scribes, which meant a payroll. An archive isn't a permanent record, it's a relay race. And when we stop passing the baton, the story stops.